Within the science of biology, anatomy is the study of physical, structural characteristics like size, shape, location, and composition. Within the science of biology, physiology is the study of functions, how things work. In a report from some national science foundations on teaching biology, this statement is found. Structural complexity, together with the information it provides, is built upon combinations of subunits that drive increasingly diverse and dynamic physiologic responses in living organisms. Fundamental structural units and molecular and cellular processes are conserved through evolution and yield an extraordinary diversity of biologic systems seen today. The textbook edition I'm using has taken this paraphrase of that original statement and condensed it to this. How a structure functions depends on its specific form, and thus function follows form. You all don't need to hear philosophic or semantic arguments about this. The answer, if quizzed on this chapter, is just that. But you should know that because the size, shape, location, and composition of every anatomic structure has evolved to carry out its function, the phrase has always been the other way around. Form follows function. The information that makes up anatomy is divided into classes such as gross anatomy, those features that are macroscopic or large enough for us to see with our eyes, and microscopic anatomy, those structural characteristics that are too small to see without magnification. Microscopic anatomy is further divided into the anatomy of individual cells, cytology, and the anatomy of groups of cells or tissues, histology. The information about how structure changes over the lifetime of an organism is classified as developmental anatomy. This includes all the changes that occur prior to birth, the study of which is called embryology. To start the discussion about physiology, some truly basic aspects must be mentioned. Anatomy and physiology are parts of the science of life, biology. There are a variety of ways to study life, of course. We could study how living things interact with their surroundings, their environment. We could study how living things have changed over time, which, of course, has affected how they interact with their environments. Or we could study how those changes have produced different kinds of living things, how to classify them. So, physiology is the part of biology which has to do with the functions of living things, the study of how they work, and most of those functions differ, at least to some degree, among the different types of organisms. Almost all of what we will be learning about is the physiology of one specific organism, the human animal. And further still, we will be learning about the functions of the specific systems, organs, and related structures, system physiologies. Science, the collection of observations and the explanations for them, is complicated. In fact, all those parts of it we call the various sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, are so complicated that we call them complex systems of information. That complex is a key word to search on in your oh so copious free time, of course. Within those systems, the information is organized, thought about, in different categories, or in this graphic, tiers or levels. Let me explain. We could talk about biology in terms of the atoms that make up living things, or we could consider collections of atoms, molecules. But what we know about atoms tells us little or nothing about molecules. We could then study a particular type of molecule, DNA, and then find that our knowledge of molecular DNA doesn't inform us much at all about genes. Or we could examine the molecules that make up a particular cell, a myocyte muscle cell, or for another example. We must study the cells themselves to discover how they work. Our knowledge of the molecules that are inside those cells does not help with this aspect of physiology. The different types of cells interact in specific ways, generating information at a new level, the physiology of tissues. All the cells of all the tissues working together as an organ generates a different class of information, a different tier of muscle physiology. And yet again, muscles together as a system are thought about differently. And finally, for this discussion, all the science of the system's functions together does not help us understand much of the organism as a whole moving. Back to basic science. Biology is the study of life, and the basic unit of biology is the cell. Cells are the simplest living things. All living cells have several characteristics in common. They react to their environment. They obtain and use energy. They reproduce. They get rid of waste. They grow and develop. Every living cell survives by carrying out those basic functions of life: respond to environment, obtain and use energy, get rid of waste, and as all new living organisms start out as single cells, the cells at some point grow, develop, and reproduce also. But among all the organisms on Earth, cells are arranged in different ways. The most basic arrangement is single cell, or collections of cells. Combination of cells can just be clumps of cells, colonies, or they can be organized more specifically in multicellular organisms. Those different cells in each organism carry on the survival functions, of course, and other separate, different functions. Body as a whole functions, system-level physiology, are performed by different organ systems and will be presented separately in subsequent chapters. Human anatomy and physiology can be organized into these 11 organ systems: integumentary system, skin; skeletal, bones and joints; muscular, skeletal muscles; nervous, brain and spinal cord, nerves; endocrine, glands and hormones; cardiovascular, heart and blood vessels; immune, including lymphatics; respiratory, airway and lungs; digestive, gastrointestinal tract and accessory organs; urinary, kidney and urinary tract; reproductive, gametogenic organs, glands, ducts, uterus, secondary sexual organs. To repeat, in multicellular organisms, each cell has those life-sustaining characteristics, but in an environment different from unicellular organisms. The whole body is the environment of the cells, and there are a variety of body functions that provide for not only cellular survival, but survival of the organism itself. Those necessary functions include maintaining boundaries, responsiveness, movement, digestion, excretion, metabolism, growth, reproduction. Maintaining boundaries is not only separating various chemistries from each other within the cell, but also separating the organism from its environment. In a unicellular organism, that's a function of the cell membrane and wall. In the human organism, the skin provides that function. Responsiveness, or reactivity, is usually chemical in a unicellular organism. It is often much more involved in multicellular organisms and can include movement. The list of life functions now contains maintaining boundaries, responsiveness or reactivity, movement, and now digestion. In unicellular organisms, this is accomplished by engulfment, but multicellular organisms have whole systems for digestion. And there are several systems for getting rid of waste materials as well: digestive, respiratory, integumentary, and urinary systems. Those handle solid, gaseous, heat, and liquid wastes that are simply left behind in unicellular organisms. Next on the list of life functions is metabolism, which is a sort of mental shorthand for the chemistry of life. For sure, cells have chemistry that is almost universal among living organisms. And then there are classes of chemistry that are more or less specific for different kinds of cells in multicellular organisms. And then there is another category of chemistry that deals with the specific details of the chemistry unique, or nearly so, for each separate class of organism. All cells grow, even cells that are part of multicellular organisms. They must to divide. And all cells divide, at least at the beginning of the organism's life. Of course, organisms grow in their own right too. Growth turns out to be one of those vital survival characteristics. This list ends with reproduction and is simple, at least conceptually, in unicellular organisms, and significantly more complicated in multicellular life forms. These functions form a basis for studying human physiology: maintenance of boundaries, reactions, movement, digestion, excretion, metabolism, growth, and reproduction. To repeat, all cells survive by interacting with their environment, and cells in multicellular organisms survive in the environment of the whole organism. Organisms utilize some factors in the external environment to create that internal setting. Nutrition, including water, compatible temperature, adequate oxygen, are the principal components for one of the main processes in multicellular physiology: maintenance of homeostasis. Homeostasis is the maintenance of relatively stable internal conditions regardless of changes in the external environment. A major part of human physiology at an organ or organ system level is supporting homeostasis. All organ systems participate in at least some homeostatic processes. The most straightforward way to approach homeostasis is as an engineer. The body parts taking part in maintaining homeostasis are organized into receptor sensor components that sense whatever is being controlled, whichever variable: blood glucose level, body temperature, amount of blood moving through blood vessels, force of contraction of the uterus, etc. Or the body parts can be part of controller units, control centers, that receive the information from the receptors, thus monitoring the variable and sending signals to those parts of the body that can affect changes in the body. Or they can be part of those effector units themselves, usually muscles or glands. So, homeostasis involves control mechanisms, receptors, control centers, effectors, that monitor and respond to changes in zillions of different aspects of body states and functions. One last engineering idea for this chapter. If the effect of the control system is directed at the variable being monitored, that effect is fed back to the origin of the starting signal. That kind of process is called the feedback loop. Most homeostatic processes, those feedback control mechanisms in physiology, are negative feedback loops, meaning the responses reduce or shut off the original stimuli. the monitored variable changes in the opposite direction of the original change. This textbook compares homeostasis to a teeter-totter or some sort of balance, which I think is misleading. It suggests that when some variable under homeostatic control goes up, something else goes down. And that's very rarely the case in human physiology. And the idea of homeostasis as some sort of balanced system suggests that homeostatic mechanisms are like the single board of the seesaw, when in fact homeostasis is almost always maintained by separate mechanisms, adjusting the control of a variable one way or the other. Nonetheless, the picture of balance and imbalance will reappear innumerable times in this book, and I will use it here just to illustrate an example of negative feedback in homeostatic maintenance. Homeostasis of body temperature uses the nervous system as the control center. If the outside temperature rises, the body temperature will also rise transiently. That rise in temperature will be sensed by cells in the skin and nervous system, the receptors in our engineering scheme, that will in turn send signals to the central nervous system cells, control center, that are tuned to those particular signals. Then, more nervous system signals will be sent to the effector organs, including sweat glands. Sweat will be excreted onto the skin surface, where it will be evaporated using heat to turn water into water vapor. That takes heat away from the body, and the temperature lowers, reversing the initial rise. Or the outside temperature might go down, lowering the body temperature. The sensors of the body continue to send signals to parts of the central nervous system, the control centers, which detect the change and send signals in turn to the effector organs, skeletal muscles this time. The muscles rapidly contract and relax, producing shivering. That muscular action produces heat, and the body temperature rises, reversing the original stimulus. Negative feedback. Note that here shivering and sweating are completely different processes, not balanced against one another in any way. For another illustration of negative feedback loops in human physiology, let's look at a few of the mechanisms for maintaining blood glucose homeostasis, or keeping blood sugar in the optimal range. If blood sugar rises, after a meal for instance, cells throughout the body will sense this. Some of those cells are in the pancreatic islets, which are groups of beta cells. In this example, the cells are the receptors and the control center. They will release insulin into the bloodstream. Lots of cells will respond to the presence of insulin. Those cells are the effector units. They will take up glucose from the blood, and the initial rise will be reversed. If the blood glucose falls, different cells in the pancreas will put out glucagon. Effector cells, mainly in the liver, will break down glycogen, among other actions, causing release of glucose into the bloodstream, raising the blood sugar. Negative feedback. Human physiology has examples of positive feedback loops too. When labor starts, for example, the baby stretches the cervix open. That stretching is detected by specialized nerve cells in the cervix, sending signals to cells in the hypothalamus. Oxytocin is released by those cells, carried in the blood to the uterus, where the smooth muscle responds to its presence with increased contraction and further stretching of the cervix. More stretch, more oxytocin, leading to more stretch, more oxytocin, more stretch, until delivery, when there's no more stretch and thus no more stimulus for oxytocin release. Or when blood leaves a blood vessel through a tear, Platelets will adhere to the exposed tissues and release a variety of chemicals into the extravascular fluid. Some of those chemicals will diffuse into the bloodstream and attract more platelets to the forming clot. More platelets, more cytokines. Attracting more platelets to release more chemicals, attracting more platelets until the clot has matured so that no more platelets are activated to release those chemicals. The whole clotting business is a tangled set of feedback loops with cells acting as receptors, control centers, and effectors, and many of the chemicals themselves acting as receptors and effectors, all of which we will learn more about in later chapters. Anatomy is that aspect of biology that deals with structure. The characteristics we will be learning about are primarily size, shape, location, and composition. A great deal of the textbook content has to do with composition, so here the general vocabulary considerations will be on the other three features. Something not in the edition of the textbook I'm using is the anatomy vocabulary referring to size and shape. These are often used in names of various structures and frequently are Latin. Sorry, that's the history of this science. So, example of size words are foramen magnum, big hole of the skull. Gluteus maximus, biggest muscle of the butt. Large and small intestines. Well, not every word is Latin, you know. Anatomic names can include shape indicators also. The rectus abdominis, the straight abdominal muscle. The deltoid muscles, the muscles shaped like the Greek letter delta, a triangle. Or the orbicularis oris, the muscle orbiting or surrounding the mouth. Since an extremely important aspect of vocabulary is the accurate communication of information, there are some universal basic ideas. One of those, an important commonly used reference, is the anatomic position. This is the attitude of the body of the organism in the agreed upon reference position. For humans, this is the body standing upright with the legs straight, arms straight down at the sides of the torso, palms forward so the thumbs are out laterally, head up facing the observer. With that reference, the anatomic position, some important anatomic terms can be defined. It's important to note that almost all of these terms can be used in two ways, indicating either location, position, or direction. The textbook table calls them orientation or directional terms. As an example, superior, and of course the opposite, inferior, can mean at the top of something. The bony limits of the pelvic girdle mark the superior extent of the pelvic cavity, the space within the bones of the pelvis. Or it can mean towards the upper end of the body. The thigh is superior, towards the top of the body, to the knee. All the words in the table have both position and direction meanings. One pair of words often confused is proximal and distal. Proximal means next to, or towards the beginning, and distal means away from, or towards the distant part. So, the part of the nerve cell's axon, that thread-like extension, that is next to, near the cell body, is proximal. And the point where the deltoid muscle attaches to the bones of the arm is distal to, away from, where the muscle attaches to the bones of the shoulder. The human body has places or parts that are universally present, providing ready reference points, regional terms. Two such are the major divisions of the body, the axial region, the head and trunk, and the appendicular regions, the limbs. Location words in anatomy can refer to parts or places of the body in anatomic position too. Lines or axes, the singular is axis, like coordinates and graphs in math, and planes based on those lines are used all the time, though the axes are used mostly to describe movements and not mentioned in our textbook. A body plane is a flat surface along which the body may be viewed or cut for anatomic study. The three main reference planes are the sagittal plane, the frontal or coronal plane, and the transverse or horizontal plane. You might note that captions of pictures and drawings of structures in the textbook use the plane that is being viewed. Sections are surfaces, body planes, revealed by cutting, truly in dissection and microscopy, or virtually in imaging. The sagittal plane divides the body vertically into right and left parts. A sagittal section is produced if the structure is cut along this plane, mid-sagittal, median, in the midline of the body, and parasagittal, not in the midline. A frontal coronal plane divides the body vertically into anterior and posterior parts. A frontal or coronal section is produced when the body or specimen is cut along that plane. The transverse or horizontal plane divides the body horizontally into superior and inferior parts, and the sections in this plane, all up and down the body, are colloquially called cross sections. If the plane, view, or drawing does not line up exactly with one of the standard body planes, it's called an oblique view or section. Spaces, volumetric regions within the body, are called cavities. The two major ones are the dorsal body cavity at the back or dorsum of the body, and the ventral body cavity, the front or belly side. These spaces are normally closed to the external environment and lined by thin sheets of tissue called membranes. Much more about that in later chapters. The dorsal body cavity protects the nervous system and has two subdivisions. The cranial cavity encases the brain, and the vertebral cavity encloses the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity houses the internal organs, viscera, and also has two subdivisions, the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity, separated by a muscle called the diaphragm. Those subdivisions are also divided. The thoracic cavity includes two pleural cavities, each containing a lung, and the mediastinum, the lower portion of which is the pericardial cavity enclosing the heart. The abdominopelvic cavity is subdivided into the abdominal cavity, which contains the stomach, intestines, pancreas, spleen, liver, and gallbladder, and the pelvic cavity, which contains the urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and the rectum. The cavities of the human body are lined by membranes. The ventral cavity and its subdivisions are lined by membranes, here indicated by what the computer calls aqua tint, that secrete a watery lubricant. They're thus called serous membranes. Much more will be presented in later chapters. At times, it's useful to identify regions within the abdomen. There is vocabulary used primarily by medical personnel. The right and left upper quadrants, the right and left lower quadrants. Of course, one might imagine that as completely unacceptable by anatomists, so there's a different, more precise vocabulary of abdominal regions used by them. The right hypochondriac region, that part on the right side of the abdomen, hypo or below, condo referring to the ribs. The epigastric region, the part above, epi, the gastrium, stomach. The left hypochondriac region. The right lumbar region, the portion on the right side of the abdomen that extends back to the lumbar spine. The umbilical region, the area around the umbilicus or belly button. the left lumbar region, the right iliac inguinal region, the lower portion of the abdomen on the right side that includes the iliac region of the pelvic bones, the hypogastric or the pubic region containing and above the pubic bones of the pelvis, and the left iliac or inguinal region. There are other spaces within the body, other cavities, many of which are exposed to the external environment, such as the oral or digestive cavity, the nasal cavity, the orbital cavities, the middle ear cavities. There are some others that are not connected to the external environment at all, like the synovial cavities, the spaces within certain movable joints.